And we are live, everybody. Welcome to the Gamification Revolution. I'm your host, Gabe Zickerman, and we're joined today by Melvin Greer, who's coming to us live from Washington, D.C. Hi, Melvin.
Hey, how's it going?
Awesome. Great to have you here. It is a overcast day in New York today, but thankfully we're staying cool. And as always, I want to remind those of you who are joining us live today with Melvin that you can get your questions answered about gamification and government and education, because we've got a lot to talk about today with Melvin, by clicking one of these buttons that you'll see somewhere on your screen, depending on which version of this website you're looking at. And they'll say submit question, and you can submit those questions and we'll get them on here, and Melvin and I will do our best to answer them in the 30 minutes that we have. If you have a camera, you can, on your computer, you can actually click the camera button and we'll try to bring you on screen. Ivan, our intrepid producer, will make sure that everything's working and get you on here and you can get your questions answered. And also, you can check out Melvin's amazing talk from the just finished Gamification Summit in San Francisco in April by accessing it by the link you see below, or gsummit.com, and you can see kind of greater length what sort of Melvin has been working on and some of the interesting ideas he has for the transformation of government and education with gamification. And so with that, I want to get started with the question for you, Melvin. So many people feel like the education system needs kind of a sort of rethink, particularly as it relates to STEM and STEAM education, which you just sort of informed me on before the big break. Do you think that gamification is really like a breakthrough opportunity to fix STEM education, or is it just like another kind of fad that, just like all the other fads for fixing ed that have been thrown this direction?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question because there's an intense focus on education, but it's a really complex answer because there's a lot of things you have to peel back in order to talk about changing education. I am an educator, so I spend a lot of time with students, and what I can tell you is that just like many other portions of business, the idea of developing digital transformational kinds of environments and abilities is an important aspect. And so, gamification plays a very important and significant role in helping to engage both the educator in a new style to create enthusiasm and stickiness, if you will, to this idea of training and education. But it also is an important important aspect of this understanding of the adaptation of the current uh, force that's the current folks that are in the generation that are in the education system.
You mean the
These
students?
born digital, yeah, the students. These born digital students have different ways of learning and different ways of communicating, different ways of collaborating, different ways of learning than folks in our generation gave.
So let's say,
And so
yeah, and by the way,
gamification is an important.
because you look very young, so I appreciate us being in the same group. But here's a question for you, which many people say, like, okay, so these different learning styles, I assume that what you mean is that the students that you're referring to have shorter attention spans or can't focus or something like that, or need some technology. But what about all these people who are like, well, you know what, the games are actually the problem. Like, why don't we just like get the kids to stop playing games or interacting with the iPad all the time, and then they would just sit down and focus and learn? Like, what do you say to those people?
Well, first, I don't think that the impediment is that the people aren't focused or aren't capable of learning in different styles. I think the real issue is that there is a better way of communicating things. There's a new game from Dragon Box that just came out that teaches students how to learn algebra in 42 minutes. I've been playing this game with my 4-year-old, and he's really picking up the concepts of math in a way that he doesn't get in his preschool, and he goes to a private school. But what I think the real issue is that there's an opportunity to take advantage of some of the linkages that are already in place and the enthusiasm that are already in place in other areas of the students' lives. So they already have this concept of social media. They already have this concept of big data and cloud and mobility. These enabling technologies are the kind of underpinnings of gamification. And by using gamification, we are creating a force multiplier. And then students are now gravitating to this concept because it accelerates what they've already been learning.
So do you think that if, like, let's take the example of your kid, for example, or, some of the kids that I think you're thinking of in your model and your framework for thinking about STEM, science, technology, education, math, and STEAM, science, technology, education, arts, and math education, which is the subject that we're talking about. Do you think that
Right.
if we designed like good enough learning games and we put those in front of kids, do you think we could just like replace the way that we teach with them? Is that the classroom of the future? Just kids like kind of sitting in front of games? What is it that we're actually talking about here in practice?
What we're really talking about, and I talk about this in my newly formed Institute on Leadership and Innovation, because it's got a focus on STEM and STEAM. One of the key aspects of the new learning model that creates new leaders and innovators is an experiential understanding of the education or the learning topic. So if you remember when we learned math or algebra, it was more rote. There were some things that we learned, the mechanics of how algebra works,
Yes.
how math works, but there wasn't a real experiential understanding of what we're going to use algebra for. This new game that my son is now participating in is teaching him in an experiential way that mathematics and algebra specifically have a real meaningful use. And what that does is that creates a stickiness to how it works so that it can be applied in other ways. Do I think that's going to obviate the need for any other kinds of education styles? No, I don't think so, because we've already talked about the fact that people learn different ways. And there's some subjects that lend themselves to gamification better than others.
So
But I think that certainly included in the portfolio.
so let's dig in for 1 second on math, and then I want to talk about your institute because I think people want to understand what that's about and how that's come together, especially based on your incredibly unique experience. So I remember my mom had a series of market stalls and small shops when I was growing up, and from a very early age, I went and sold with her and sold in her shops. And my interest in math really started by being able to make change with her at the store, which was an important thing that I actually had to be able to do. Now, I wasn't a bad math student even before that, but I was quite young, and it was like something that I had to be able to do, and I watched her being able to count money and make change really super easily. A practical application that I think I put most of my math understanding through a kind of commerce viewpoint. And so Aiden actually
Isn't that
asked this,
great?
he actually asked this really interesting question, kind of dovetailing on that and what you described, practical applications. So, okay, so kids are playing lemonade stand, they're playing algebra games that establish the real world application of that, or they have an experience like mine where math is, core to this real world experience. How do we actually measure that thing that students have gotten from school or from the games that they're learning within school actually are being transferred properly to real world applications? Isn't that the place where
Yeah, that's
things are just drop off a cliff and we stop paying attention to the stats? Like, what's happening?
that's a great question, and most people would be surprised, but the actual measurement is the same measurement as we do for any other subject in any other way we would measure their competency in this particular area. We're talking about math and algebra. The difference is that the way we're teaching it provides them a more easy way to adapt and learn in a practical sense how to apply it. I'm not a dragon box investor, and I don't have any particular bent toward them. I just have been playing it recently with my son. And what I can tell you is that they break up algebra into learning equations in a way that is very, very systematic, but it's easy for a kid to learn in a graphical user experience way. And like most games, there is this immediate reward system. Great, you've done a fantastic job. You got the first one right. There's the concepts of all the game mechanics that you would expect, the leaderboards and the points and badges. And what it does is systematically drive this understanding of differential equations in a way that we expect kids to learn. The measurement is exactly the same. We give them a test. We determine whether or not they can apply it, either in terms of a written essay or being able to solve for X, Y, or the equation. But the reality is that the style with which we deliver the material helps to gain attraction with and not make it so fearful. Oh, you're going to learn math. And I'm sure making change was really more associated with making money than giving the money back to people in terms of change. So it kind of stuck with you.
So All right, so this kind of interesting sort of question because and Ivan sort of points out that maybe the assessment methods actually need a little bit of retooling in this gamified education context because games are kind of a continuous assessment system, and you were just talking about testing. So here's one thing that I think is often a disconnect. Most corporations that do any kind of testing do the testing on employees before they come in, but then rely on kind of ongoing assessment systems from then on in terms of how they treat employees and how they deal with their growth. And the education system is mostly based on kind of testing. Do you think like these high stakes sort of tests, right? Do you believe
Right.
that gamification, particularly for STEM, suggests that we should move away from high stakes testing, or do you think that's something we have to live with and kind of work with as it is?
So I think that we'll always have that, but I believe that gamification, and I talk about this as the third leg of this new leadership and innovation model. The reason is because just as you described, if we're going to take this concept of STEM and STEAM and turn it into a real leadership and innovation characteristic, then it's got to be ongoing. And gamification is an important mechanism for creating an ongoing assessment capability. And it's certainly something we're going to take advantage of, not just for a specific subject, but for an approach to solving complex problems or to the way that we interact and organize with and collaborate with other people. And how do we create the value propositions for disruptive technologies? These are things that are ongoing things that gamification will help us with.
So that's very interesting because what you've really talked about is kind of moving the needle away from like, can you remember that 12 times 12 is 144, which is burned in my brain from my early childhood, to some other question. And I want to talk about that Leadership Institute, and I want to remind everybody who's here with us on the Gamification Revolution that if you have questions, you can click the Submit Question button and post your questions or comments in the chat, and we'll get to them today. You can also watch Melvin's incredibly engaging talk from G Summit at gsummit.com, or follow the link that's there on your screen to find out more about it. So Melvin, you've made references a couple of times, and let's talk about this institute that you're working on. Tell us about it and how you came to found it.
We came to found this thing called the Greer Institute for Leadership and Innovation because what we're finding is that there's a significant gap with respect to how leadership is being developed and being delivered. There's a need for continuous innovation, and there are lots of examples and case studies that I'm referencing in a new book on this subject, as well as there's a need to understand the mandate that's associated with now leadership and innovation, both from a government perspective and from an industry's perspective. We are dealing with a set of problems today that are so complex and global in nature, have a higher degree of interdependency, that our former leadership models and leadership development styles don't create the kinds of leaders that allow us to fully optimize this capability. And so this institute is driven to help try to solve some of these challenges.
So, okay, so and folks can find out more about your work at melvingreer.com, and I encourage everybody to kind of check it out. So, Melvin, you work for Lockheed Martin, a really big government contractor. You have your own, obviously, you've got a deep sort of well of expertise. So, what do you think the implications are for government with gamification? What is the role of gamification in advancing leadership innovation in the government sphere?
Yeah, so government is a really great domain to talk about gamification because they've been involved in gamification, the federal government at least has, for more than 2 or 3 decades. And they've been talking more about it in terms of simulations and games. So it's not surprising that folks have been creating entertainment games or education and training games focused in on government missions. But what's happened that's really, really new is that the federal government has created a federal games guild. And this games guild is being led by and attended by more than 70 federal agencies with the specific objective of understanding how games and gamification can be infused into the solution development process for the federal government. Coexisting with this discussion around gamification are the enabling technologies that make gamification possible. So the federal government has a cloud computing first policy. is focusing in on enterprise mobility, is investigating large-scale data sets, and understanding how to apply the inputs from social media into this mix as well. So these four disruptive technologies that we talk about in the Institute really are being used by government to harness the power of gamification to solve complex problems. And a perfect example is the one that we talked about in the G Summit with NIH and the folded game. I don't know, Gabe, you may remember that we talked about this problem of HIV remediation that NIH was working on for about 15 years. They gave it to a number of gamers that were looking at this problem from a different angle with no formal education in microbiology or the biological sciences, and they were able to solve the folded of the protein in less than 15 days. And so what's happening is federal agencies, and I mean agencies that are easily recognizable by you, like the Department of Defense, NASA, and others, they're taking serious looks at gamification to determine how we might apply those concepts to their particular missions.
So what do you think are kind of the big opportunities there? I mean, most people, when they talk about government and gamification, most of the examples that I hear, and when people say that, they really mean something like civic participation on one hand and the delivery of government services on the other hand. Is that what we're talking about, or is there something else going on?
I think it certainly includes that. I mean, the idea that civic participation is part of it is what we mean when we talk about how social media gets involved. And we've seen examples of that. So when we talk about the Office of Management and Budget putting out a game that allows citizens to take a look at the current federal budget and attempt to balance it themselves. And they use that information to determine priorities for policy. That's one way of doing it. But I think extending that, now we're talking about how to solve real hard problems like this one we talked about with HIV. Or how do I create a sustainable energy model that includes solar, geothermal, and maybe other sustainable energy types like ocean thermal power generation.
So you're
problem solving that includes other things outside of just civic participation and game theory.
And so are you thinking about, when you talk about things like that, when you say solving hard problems, do you mean like engaging the mass market, engaging the average citizen in that quest? Or are you talking about ways that the government can leverage its own like ecosystem, its own employees, the civil servants, the constellation of contractors to accomplish that?
So yes and yes. Certainly we're going to see that internally. We're going to see that externally. But much like what we see in some of these hard problems, we might even find focus areas. So there may be somebody or a subset of people who know how to send a rocket ship to Jupiter without any liquid propellant. And so there's only, I don't know, maybe 100 people who know how to do that. How do we morph synthetic biology research into sustainable energy? There's probably 5 or 6 people who know how to do that. We can create a game construct that allows people who have these specialized skills to participate in ways that they couldn't before.
So it's sort of interesting to me, right? But all those things are kind of interesting, and it ends up kind of begging this question, which I talked about when we were looking at these grand challenges I wrote about in my book, like the Ansari X Prize, for example, for space exploration. One of the weird things about those big crowdsourced games for problem solving is that often entities that are heavily invested in the solution are the ones who end up winning anyway. So Lockheed, for example, wins a disproportionate number of crowdsourced challenges, and not to make this about Lockheed, but it wins a disproportionate number of crowdsourced challenges related to propellant because it happens to be a big expert in that subject, or expert in the subject of making different kinds of vehicles for exploration or for the military. So ultimately those kinds of challenges feel exciting on paper, but then in practice, don't they just bring out the same old kind of ideas from the same old people, so we might as well just tender them in the classic government way? Like, why do this any different?
Yeah, that would be great if we were talking about games, Gabe. And in the truest sense of the word, games really operate like that. But with gamification, what we're really looking at is the value extraction, is the big data analytical capabilities that are coming from the playing of the game, not necessarily the solution development of the game.
Okay. I see.
So that the value proposition Yeah, the value proposition isn't how you won the game or what you did to win the game. The value proposition could very well be the various approaches to solving the game problem set that weren't even available or even thought of before. And so this concept of gamification is different than games for this very reason, because the intellectual capital of games is generally focused in at the competency of the player and the arriving at a particular outcome. Whereas gamification, the value proposition in many cases is the varied approach, because in gamification, as you know, there is no set approach. Every approach that's possible to win the game is open to the player. And extracting the big data analytics from that is really more valuable than in many cases what the solution itself is.
So let me ask you a question. So governments are, like let's say the U.S. federal government, is it just, it's just like a really, really, really big company, right? And you work in private industry, you're an educator, you've worked on setting up this institute and you focus on the kind of gov topic. How do you think gamification of government is by definition different from gamification of the enterprise, a corporate enterprise? What's different about how we might approach the problem in this sphere?
Yeah, well, first of all, Gabe, there's a lot of discussion about government being kind of a corporate entity, and I'm really not one of those people who ascribe to that, because I really understand that government does play a significantly different role than industry. You expect different things from government than you do the company that you buy products from, and of course, there are certain aspects of the delivery of things that the government does in a way that is completely different than a corporate entity. So when we talk about gamification in the private sector, things that are kind of not necessarily focused in on are a complete focus area in government. And when I talk about privacy and I talk about security, these are the cornerstones that need to be dealt with in gamification for government that may not necessarily be the highest priority in industry. So when we talk about how citizens participate, how their data is being used, who has access to and can then analyze that data, this is an aspect of federal law and not just a good idea for the business.
So right.
Other areas there are a number of areas that are different as well.
I think one of the interesting kind of case studies that we looked at, and we've got some questions lined up that we're going to get to in 1 second. So one of the interesting case studies, that I often talk about in gamification of Gov, was this Idea Street project that James Gardner built for the UK Department of Work and Pensions, where they had a kind of stock market, that people could come up with ideas, and anybody inside this organization could come up with an idea and then buy or sell it and sort of rank the best ideas, and the organization very quickly sort of came up with these major innovations that saved them tens of millions of pounds, and it's kind of a significant number, immediately paid for the whole program basically in the first 90 days.
Sure.
The question that I have for you is, what do you think are the impediments to driving innovation and leadership in like large government entities that gamification addresses specifically? Because one of the obvious things about that is, okay, that's novel, but it's different from the way like, oh, put a comment and put in a card and drop it in the box. But what other ways is gamification activating this unique kind of need for innovation and leadership in government?
Yeah, this is a core element of one of the focuses in the new book, Leadership and Innovation, that's coming from the Institute, is all about. The idea is, of course, is that these disruptive technologies are changing how leadership and innovation are being developed. And we talked about these 4 disruptive technologies. One of the critical factors that gamification helps us to solve is, when is it applicable and when is it not? So there are elements where it's not a really good idea to use cloud computing or big data or social media. And in those cases, coincidentally, these are also places where we don't easily find gamified solutions for some of the problems we have. For whatever reason, whether it's a deployment model, a security capability, most significantly though, it's the inability to create a successful business model that is driving this move away from a gamified structure in government as opposed to anything else.
Do you think that the one of the things that I've often talked about on the gov side is things like reach to the top, the Obama administration's giant kind of, gamified challenge to get the states to come up to speed on Common Core and education and so on.
Right.
There are these, grand programs that come down from, often from the White House or come down from, senior cabinet members. And then there's this, the group that you described, the kind of games and gov group that's working at a more sort of grassroots level. Do you think if we see gamification take hold in the government, is it going to come from that top-down perspective? Do we need the president to get in front of, at the Rose Garden and say, games and gamification are the future of transforming government? Or is it really going to be more of a bottoms-up effort where we've got, key influencers and stakeholders, technologists in each department kind of advocating for their ideas as needed to move forward the specific projects on their desk? Where is this going to happen?
I think you're going to see both, and that's probably not a fair answer. We've already seen the president talk about harnessing the 10,000 hours that 55 million Americans spend on playing games, and seeing if we can harness that to solve real innovative solutions for government. He's already talked in the State of the Union about a school in New York that is a model for the use of gamification in the delivery of education to its students. So that's already happened. And of course, at the agency level, almost every day we see new gamified capabilities that are being infused into complex missions. We see the Department of Energy looking at synthetic biology. We look at the Department of Defense trying to increase its training competency in the different types of asymmetrical warfare. We see NASA looking at trying to gamify missions to Mars and so on. And each of these has a cumulative effect. What it does is provide success criteria and new ways of measuring what we mean by gamification, because it is still nascent, but it also gives us a kind of a blueprint and a roadmap to go forward as we establish top-down policies along with some kind of bottom-up, real grassroots exercises.
I love your optimism about this subject, Melvin. I'm a kind of I'm a believer that government can be good, and it's nice to talk to somebody who has such optimism about transforming that. And I know you're right. You're right in the eye of the storm. And I want to just take us back briefly or forward, depending on how you want to look at it. So Amy Baskin, thanks for being with us. Amy, also a speaker at G Summit, like you were, educator from Florida. She said that you mentioned, and I recall that you mentioning, some topics are great for gamification and others are not. How do you, in the education space, when you think about, leveraging gamification for ed, how do you distinguish between those opportunities where gamification is like, top of mind for how we solve this problem and ones where it's not?
Yeah, so this is really not that much different than any other game designer. And as you know, the focus is on the player. How is the player going to interact with the game, and what is it that you're trying to achieve? In my research at the University of Puerto Rico, we're developing a new game that helps us understand the mutations of photosynthetic properties in cells for a sustainable energy model development. It's a great opportunity for us to learn and get many more people involved in this subject. When we find topics that don't lend themselves to the collaborative style, kind of big data analytics, that are not easily enabled by some sort of mobility or cloud computing environment, that have a hard privacy or security construct, these are not the kinds of methods or subjects that lend themselves to kind of gamified strategies. So when we talk about biological sciences, we're trying to teach people how to actually become biologists, a marine biologist, or learn how to become a brain surgeon. There's a practical application of that needs to happen maybe outside of a game construct. Perhaps there's a gamified capability that we can add. So if there's a particular tool, like a robot, that's going to be infused into that discussion, we can add that. But the overall experiential understanding of the biological sciences has to have a more practical sense and more hands-on than a game.
So at some point, it's got to shift to the real world and can't stay virtual forever, I guess, is your point. And that's really, really super interesting. And I want to say that for those of you who are interested in finding out more about Melvin's Institute and his new book and the work that he's doing, you can follow him on Twitter at lead_innovate and at melvingreer.com. Melvin, thanks so much for joining us today.
Is it over already? What happened?
30 minutes goes by so fast, my friend. Thank you for being with us on the Gamification Revolution. Thanks to everybody who joined us live and for all your questions. If you want to find out more about gamification, you can check out gamification.co, Melvin's talk at gsummit.com, and we'll be back again next week with more great guests talking about how we use engagement science and technology to transform the world. Thanks again, Melvin, for being with us.
Thank you very much, Gabe.
And to all of you at home, thanks to you as well. And in the meantime, keep having fun, everybody. Goodbye.